I'm going to kick that off. Can I come to you first, Euan? Tell me a little bit about yourself and what your definition would be.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Louise. Really a pleasure to be here. My name is Euan Murray. I'm the Chief Executive of the Sustainability Consortium, a non-profit working to make all consumer goods sustainable. I'm actually going to let the other guys take a go at defining resilience, and so I won't preempt that. I think rather I'll tell you what I think it isn't. And I'd say a resilient supply chain isn't guaranteed to be a sustainable supply chain. Of course, it absolutely can be, but there's no guarantee. So, for example, it's possible to have a supply chain that is highly resilient to the weather, the changing impacts of climate change, but that same supply chain could also have a very big carbon footprint in its own right. And so really the smart companies are the ones that are taking a combined approach, that are combining transparency, sustainability, and resilience into a sort of holy trinity to deliver results for them and society at large.
That's great. Getting us started with thinking about the Holy Trinity. And this is going to be a very exciting discussion. Christian, perhaps you could introduce yourself and your definition.
Yes, thank you, Louise, and happy to be with you today. So, Christian, I am in charge of purchasing for LVMH. For those who don't know, LVMH is Louis Vuitton Moitensi. So we are the #1 luxury group in the world, and so I'm in charge of coordinating the purchasing function within the group. To come to your question, Louise, about resilience, if we take just resilience just as this word, I would say that a good resilience is making sure that we have any disruption on this supply chain. So making sure that despite what we live, and we have a good exercise on these days, I would say, is to making sure that my supply chain is still being able to fulfill what I need.
You'll see a poll has appeared up on the screen. If whilst you're listening to our introductions, you could just fill in the poll. This is just to really give us an idea about how resilient you're feeling about your supply chain at the moment. Jamie, could I ask you to introduce yourself and your description of resilience?
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jamie Barismatov. I'm one of the co-founders and the COO at SupplyShift. SupplyShift is a transparency platform to help companies understand more about their suppliers and their supply chains. I'll also change the question a little bit, just like Euan did, and I'll say, what's a necessary requirement for resiliency? And I think it's knowing who is in your supply chain and knowing what they're doing, in very high level terms, knowing who's in your supply chain beyond tier 1, knowing what risks they pose. And I'll even kind of, Euan and I know each other quite well, but I'll just butt heads for a minute and say that I think for too long we've thought about resiliency as supply chain disruption. And maybe you have a resilient supply chain that maybe is resilient to disruption, the traditional disruptions we think about, and that sustainability is about carbon and human rights. But in reality, you don't have a resilient supply chain if a news article can destroy your reputation and then hurt your sales. So I don't think we should think about these things as separate things. And I think you can't have one without the other. And they are, I guess, to agree with you, and I'll go back to that merging concept. Yep.
Very good, very good. And Mark, now we've discovered where you were. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar. Would you mind introducing yourself and your definition of resilience?
Oh, sorry, I was hiding out in the audience. I would have thought I would have got quite good at Zoom, wouldn't you, by now? So I am the Director of Sustainable Operations for Natura & Co, or have been for the last 2 weeks. Until 2 weeks ago, I was the Procurement Director for the Body Shop. So Natura & Co, you might not have heard of us. We're the world's largest direct sales cosmetics company. So we include Natura, the Body Shop, Avon, and a little company called Aesop based out of Melbourne, which is growing quite fast. We've got lots of customers around the world, lots of direct sales. Definition of resilience, I'd say there's a strong element of adaptability. And I think just hearing about what some of the other panelists were saying, a lot of that's about knowing your supply chain and the risks in your supply chain and having mitigations in place to to fix problems when they arise and anticipate them before they arise, would be my snapshot definition.
Fantastic, fantastic. Now, Alexia, is it possible to publish the poll, and let's have a sense of how our audience is feeling about resilience?
Of course, it's quite impressive, and yeah, not so bad at all. Let me just share them with everyone now. I hope everyone can see them.
Okay, so we've got about 25% of the audience isn't feeling too confident about supply chain resilience. About 47% are there in terms of feeling moderately confident. So they've got an idea about the core and high risk products at tier 1. They've got some limited visibility of tier 2 and 3, and they're working on the mitigations. And then we've got a 24% who are really confident that they've got some effective mitigations in place. So that's excellent news. So that I'm expecting to be learning something from the Q&A from yourselves as well. Now, I want to turn Christian and Mark just to thinking about, obviously, who could have anticipated the year we've had. What have you learnt about supply chain resilience as a result of this year? Who'd like to kick us off? Christian. You're on mute.
Yeah. So to come to your questions, I think that, I mean, at least for us within LVMH, we have very different type of activities. So we can go from leather, perfume, cosmetic, so many different things, champagne. And so what we have to do to make sure that our supply chain is resilient is really to dig in each of the key strategic categories that we have to source. I don't know, if I take the example of leather, for example, we can speak just about leather as a whole, but clearly even on this category, we have to focus on, do we speak about exotic leather? Do we speak about classical leather from Co, for example? And clearly, depending on the category that we see, the supply chain is different. The issues that we have on the supply chain are different. And so we really have to dig in. And I saw that on the pool that we just had, some people are saying, I'm quite good at tier 1, but I have clear issues to go deeper to tier 2, tier 3, and on the different fields. And so for us, what we try to do is really to identify what are the key supply chain that we have, which could be at risk, but which are key also for us, and to manage that and to go as deep as we can on the supply chain to make sure that all along the supply chain, I would say, everything is done fine, especially on sustainability topics.
Fantastic.
So that's the main thing on resilience for us.
And Mark, can I come to you in terms of how's your thoughts on resilience changed as a result of the year and how far it's progressed? You're on mute.
Goodness me, again, you would have sort of learned by now. So what have I learned? But I think if I reflect principally on the Body Shop, as that's where I've been for most of the last year. So when I think about it, there are two real things that have happened over this year. And one's been a big shift in demand from our customers. So started the year expecting to sell lots of skincare, lots of gifts, etc. And within 2 months was having to make millions of hand sanitizers and soaps and hand washes. So there's been a dramatic, immediate shift in what the customer wants. There's also been a real shift in how she buys as well. So from going to stores to buying online and we run a massive 8 million consultant direct sales business, which has been hugely boosted by people being at home, it appears. And that also changes the mix of what people want to buy. So there's been a real shift in what customers want, which I think is, one end of resilience is the supply chain, but the other end of that supply chain is what customers want to buy. So there's been a dramatic shift in what people want. At the same time, obviously, everyone in the world went out and tried to start making and buying hand sanitizers, hand creams and soaps at the same time. So the first thing you suddenly recognize is that actually you can think you have a resilient supply chain, but there's a black swan event like COVID-19 comes along and you realize your supply chain is not as resilient as you wanted it to be. And frankly, I guess I'd also question, is it possible to have a supply chain that's resilient against an event like the COVID pandemic in the last year? What you can do, and what we have recognized very quickly, is that the suppliers who you know well, the supply chains you know well, and Christian was mentioning this a minute ago about going down the supply chain, where you have got those really in-depth knowledge of your supply chain, they have the ability to bounce back and adapt very quickly. So the kind of heartening part of it is where you look at suppliers who you knew were good before, you know, where it had strong environmental and ethical practice, good quality and on time and full metrics, and where you had a strong relationship with them. They adapted very quickly and were able to meet this massive shift in demand and also the disruption in supply chain. But what it really reinforced was where you've got those more tactical supply chains, they're not up to it. And, you know, I'll be transparent, at the start of the crisis, I wasn't expecting to make a loss of hand sanitizers. In fact, I was expecting to discontinue them. And so those weren't necessarily the most robust supply chains. So you ended up, the ones you didn't think were important, but really what it did reinforce is that transparency, collaborative way of working was super important to be able to deal with it.
And so that's very, very helpful, Mark. And so that kind of brings me, Jamie, to yourself. What have you seen at SupplyShift in terms of what your customers are asking for to help them to have more supply chain resilience? Has the ask changed? You're on mute.
Yep. You know, so SupplyShift is born out of providing transparency with increasing, you know, to increase sustainability. And, you know, for years we've been talking to responsible sourcing folks, and, you know, platform is great, but, you know, we're having a hard time convincing the procurement staff that transparency is important. I think that's shifted on its head almost, where we'll show like, oh, this is, you can have this map of your supply chain. If you were to map different commodities, this is what you would have. And that procurement director who maybe wasn't paying that much attention to sustainability beforehand says, wow, if I had that map when COVID started, I could have reacted much faster. I would have known more. Not sure exactly what would have been different, but I wouldn't have been caught on my heels as much. So I think that it's kind of a dramatic shift where instead of saying we're going to do one project, we're going to help you, you know, track a certain material, a certain issue. It's like, okay, but I need a platform that I can use across all of my commodities. I need a platform that I can use when a new issue comes up, and that's getting the attention more of higher levels in the procurement organization. So I think that's been a dramatic shift where people see that there's value to this type of information and this type of approach for multiple parts of the business. And I think that's going to be really important going forward for all these dramatic issues that we're facing.
Yeah, so proactive planning makes sense, doesn't it, rather than being reactive. Now, Euan, I noticed that you produced a brilliant report with the HSBC on looking at improving supply chain resilience. Would you like to share just a few of the kind of key takeaways from that report?
Sure, yeah, happy to. And so here we focused in with HSBC on understanding what it takes to build a resilient supply chain in the face of impending climate change, climate breakdown. And of course, then coronavirus hit. And what we pretty quickly discovered was that there was so many overlaps in that original research that we did with what was actually playing out in real time. But climate change over the long haul will, and in fact is already having a range of different impacts similar to those we've seen with COVID. You know, it's increasing the frequency and the magnitude and the scope for acute supply chain disruptions. You know, think freak weather. It's also going to create chronic shortages and other changes in supply chains that companies will need to adapt to. You know, think about changing growing regions for particular crops simply because the good weather for those crops has moved within regions or countries or even continents. And it will create new types of risks that have not typically been seen, particularly around supply chain management. So think things like sea level rise and where you locate stores and factories and distribution centers. And really,
you in with two different types of strategy, hadn't you? Kind of a bridging and a buffering strategy.
Yeah, that's right. There are some two main approaches we identified, one that we called bridging and the other buffering. And really bridging strategies are designed to enhance the capability of a company to withstand risks and recover more quickly. So things like collaborative planning and control, helping suppliers secure additional financial support, and developing stronger relationships with those suppliers and others along the value chain. And then buffering strategies, really it's about protecting your company from inevitable supplier failures and supply disruptions, really about building in enough redundancy, enough slack in the system. And here using things like inventory management, lead time management and capacity, looking at liability and also cost buffers can help make the operation more resilient. And I'd say no one approach fits everyone. Really, it's often a blend of these different things. But the report goes into some specifics with a checklist for how to tackle that. And I will put a link into the chat function here in a moment so that everyone can grab that and download the report if you want to look further.
Fantastic. Thank you, Euan. So when we think about supply chains of the future, and we think about them from a sustainability point of view, we're thinking about how we're going to decarbonize to zero, how we're going to move from kind of linear supply chains, you know, get the raw materials, make, sell and dispose, to thinking much more of a circular model. And we're going to be wanting to think about how we can have more of a positive impact on nature and society. So I'm really keen to explore a little bit more with each of the panel, what tools businesses are using to accelerate this transition. And I think, you know, starting off, we've already talked about it, this whole need to have greater transparency about the supply chain and to start to really understand where are your most material impacts. So can I start, Christian, with you? How have you gone about thinking about that?
That's a very large question. So trying to answer to that, I mean, we are a global company, and some of the products that we need to do our final product clearly are coming from everywhere in the world. When we are speaking, I know if I speak about a color gemstone, for example, that one of our brand is selling, clearly it's coming from different parts of the world, which means that all along the supply chain, if I focus, for example, just on the transportation part, many products that we need, raw material, are coming from everywhere in the world. So taking that into account, what is, I would say, simple for us is most of the time, the final product that we do, for example, jewelry, champagne, for example, or even bags, are made from somewhere which is very precise. It's made in France, it's made in Italy. So that's something which is key in the DNA of a maison, is to say the bag that you will purchase will be, for example, made in France. So which means that all the raw material have to come to one place where we do the final product. And after, the issue that we have on the downstream of a supply chain is our product, when they are done, have to go back or to go to where are our customers. A big change that we have with the COVID clearly is before many people were coming, for example, in Europe, I mean, to the stores, purchasing the product, Chinese people, for example, or people from the US also. And so our customers were coming into Europe to purchase our products. Today, the issue I would say that we have is our customers have to stay in their country. And so they will purchase our products in their country, which means that, for example, if I take China, which is a huge country and where we have many customers, they are purchasing our product in China, which means that instead of purchasing it, for example, in Paris, they purchase it in China. So we increase, with the COVID, we increase, at least on this part of the supply chain, clearly we increase our impact on the scope 3 or on CO2 and climate change. So that's a big change that we are facing today. And that's one of the questions which is more and more on the top of the list, saying, okay, due to that, what do we have to change to modify what we can in our supply chain to adapt to this new world that we have, where people can't travel as much as they can before. So that's a big question that we have. So it's on the table today. We didn't solve it. We know that if we take a plane, it has a much bigger impact than if we take a boat, but then the lead time is not at all the same. then it means that maybe we need to have more stock, and the stock has also a CO2 impact. So it's clearly a balance between all these aspects that we have to take into account. With one issue that we have is to be able to collect the right data, to be able to measure in the right way, as precisely as we can, the impacts of the decision that we will take. And that's also one of the, let's say, difficulty that we have that we're trying to solve, but that's a key point also that we're working on today.
That's great. And do you use blockchain? Is blockchain part of how you get greater supply chain transparency?
We don't use blockchain on the supply chain. We use more the blockchain on the transparency of our product. And I think it was said by Euan, I think at the beginning, our customers are more and more asking us, okay, I purchased this bag, I purchased this champagne, I purchased this bag. I would like to know the different raw material, where do they come from? And there we use blockchain to have the full traceability of the raw material, which is different from having the traceability of a supply chain.
Fantastic. Can I ask the same question to you, Mark? You're on to mute, I'm afraid, Mark.
So the trouble is I was pondering, wasn't I? What was I going to say? So I guess I would, and I said this a bit in my answer to the first question, which was that I guess we kind of have a view, or have traditionally had a view, between the kind of the more strategic supply chains and the less strategic supply chains. And the recent crisis has shown us that some of our less strategic supply chains maybe provide the labels or things which are critical to selling the strategic items. But we still probably would approach it slightly differently. So if I think about strategic ingredients, for example, so within cosmetics, you've obviously got active ingredients. Those are they're the key to be able to sell and make those products. We've looked at those supply chains, and as Natura and Co, we've got some very direct relationships with a number of our suppliers, around 30 to 40 around the world, who are community-based suppliers who provide us with the biodiversity-based ingredients which lead most of our products. Now, those supply chains and suppliers ultimately could be considered to be very vulnerable. They're often based in areas like, for example, the Amazon basin near Belém, or Samoa, Ghana, India in the Sahel, not in India in the Sahel, Ghana in the Sahel, India in forest areas. And you're talking about communities who are, in quite a basic situation, in quite a vulnerable situation. And if you wanted to think about a supplier who would be vulnerable to climate change, I think the Ribeiro collectors near Belém are always the ones that spring to mind. They live in effectively a tidal flood forest. So as the tide comes in at the sea, the fresh water comes down the Amazon, where they live, floods to about 1.5 meters deep. So you can see that a couple of meters of sea rise would have a fairly dramatic impact on their lives, would absolutely threaten our supply chains, would stop us being able to access the innovative ingredients they produce, and would obviously be an environmental disaster at the same time. So there are some things we can do. I'm not King Canute, we can't hold back the sea. But what we can do is work very deeply in those supply chains, understand the risks that those people face, the ways in which they can try and mitigate the impacts of things like climate change or COVID on them, and to be able to put in place plans to help them build their resilience. And these can be quite simple things. Ultimately, in some ways, having a stable demand and stable income enables them to put money aside so that when the inevitable extraordinary floods come along, they can protect themselves. We can help them add more value to their products locally, so they're able to benefit more from that. They're able to protect the forest around them. Ultimately, and as Christian's saying, and I think you alluded to in your question around blockchain, though there is a data issue in some of this stuff. We can focus on those really strategic supply chains, we can build the resilience in them, we can invest in those supply chains. The question comes with the equally important but not necessarily so strategic supply chains, where we again have issues in them, and how do you go into those and how do you fix some of those problems? From my personal point of view and our experience, generally that works through collaboration, and we work, for example, with Christian on, I believe LVMH members, the action on sustainable derivatives, where we're able to look at the derivatives that make things like the shower gels and shampoo. So these are palm-based products where the palm is transformed to make foaming agents. They go through multiple hands, multiple transformations. traceability in that supply chain is incredibly difficult. Working through the action on sustainable derivatives, we found that the 1,800 tons of palm used to make those foaming agents for us come from 1,750 mills. So you can see there's an incredible fragmentation down that chain, and it's only by working with our competitors. I'm not sure LVMH is a direct competitor, but you know, our co-industries, our suppliers, and our supply chains in that collaborative mode, you can begin to put some of that in place. Blockchain could be interesting. I'm still waiting to see a practical use for it in supply chains, though.
Excellent. That's very, very thought-provoking. I suppose, Euan, what happens though if you're missing data? Can you give us an example of where you've worked perhaps with some brands who have looked at supply chain mapping where they don't have all the data?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. A couple of examples. So we've partnered with SupplyShift to roll out sustainable supply chain performance management program called Thesis. And it's used by over 1,500 of the largest companies around the world to manage their supply chain and the products within that, worth about $1 trillion. Now, I know Jamie's going to talk a little bit more about this in a few moments, so maybe I'll just call out another example in commodities, where really what happens is if you don't know much about your supply chain, you know, maybe if you're buying commodities on the spot market, it's often much harder to create the transparency needed, even if you're buying a lot of it. And because you simply don't know where those things have come from, it can create that real challenge. So we've worked with some organizations like Campbell's Soup, with Walmart, with Smuckers, and some others on a commodity mapping tool. And in essence, it uses published trade flow data and then combines that with satellite mapping and other mapping data to build a sort of global picture of the likely impacts of a typical sourcing strategy. So that's kind of a kind of esoteric example, but really if we think about it from a company perspective, let's say I buy wheat and I know that I buy it from a broker in the Netherlands, but I don't know any more than that. Well, the model can show, using the trade data for the Netherlands, which countries and which regions that wheat is most likely to have come from. And then it layers on top of that the impacts in those different countries of origin. So think things like deforestation risk or water impacts or biodiversity or forced and child labor. And it then gives a company a map of likely what's going on from their procurement of that particular commodity. And it's helping those companies I mentioned and others identify the sorts of risks that might be in their supply chain, and then to prioritize where they really need to go and dive more deeply. And in this sort of environment where there's so many different issues to go after, really being able to prioritize in on the biggest risks is such an important first step to taking effective action.
That's some great examples, Euan. Can I come to you, Jamie? What happens though if you're somebody on the call and you're in a bit of a state of paralysis? Where on earth do you get started on some of this?
Yeah, I mean, we see a lot of companies in that, what do I do next? And we kind of define 4 stages of this journey. So maybe I'll just go over what we see happening. And they're all kind of iterative and they all kind of impact each other. The first stage of the journey is, oh my gosh, I didn't even know I should be focusing on this. Where do I start? I have 10,000 suppliers and I make 500 different products. What do I do, right? Where do I go? And you can't have a really strong program on a certain material because you don't even know what the issues are. There are some great tools, some of those embedded within SupplyShift, to get a really high level look by commodity, by industry, by geography. Where should I focus? And then add your spend data to that, and you can really get a pretty quick rough cut about where should I focus, right? So that's kind of phase 1. And again, that's iterative because those risks change in those specific geographies. And as you address the top 3 issues you find, you're going to want to go back and then pick out the next ones. Step 2 is, okay, so my key issues, my key suppliers, how am I doing? Are these safe companies to work with? My tier one, again, great tools out there, great tools within SupplyShift to do like a code of conduct check, which might be followed up by an audit, to say, do they meet basic expectations that any global supplier should be providing? And that's, on the one hand, a great place to start. On the other hand, is nowhere near addressing the real fundamental issues. That's when you get into phase 3, where you've identified a certain issue, you've identified a certain geography, certain key materials, and then you need to go deeper. You need to map, figure out who's beyond tier 1 all the way down to the source. The issues you might find are in the field, or the issue is actually in the manufacturing process at tier 2. And that can be really helped by some of the tools that Sustainability Consortium has worked on to identify the hotspots at each stage of the life cycle of every consumer good product. So you can look at these hotspot diagrams and say, okay, I know that I'm concerned about 3 materials. I see one of them, the issue is on fields, so I have to map, and then I have to address that issue in the field. Others, it's not in the field, it's water, and it's in the manufacturing process. And so that deep dive is traditionally what we've seen companies do is take those deep dive issues, which are really the core of the issue to be solved, and kind of break them off from any kind of holistic process and say, okay, let's send out some Excel sheets, let's figure this out by email. And all of the process knowledge and all of the information ends up getting siloed away until maybe you've done some good work on that. And it's really hard to replicate that approach to addressing the different issue and the different material and the different supply chain, and the company doesn't get that holistic understanding. So that's kind of what I call step 4, but actually iterates all the way through, is bringing that information into the business process so that you feed it into your procurement system. There's flags that pop up. If you're buying palm oil, you get a flag for this supplier because they haven't done the thing that is required of my sustainable palm oil suppliers. And that can be for any material, for any issue. And that feedback loop is really the only way that a company is going to make change. If when the person going to buy the thing has the right information, because that buyer is not a sustainability expert, and we can't require them to be, but we can provide them really good information at the right time in the right way.
I absolutely agree. It is about not having a sustainability function off at one side, but absolutely embedding it and giving the tools to the people who are doing the buying and the procuring to make the most informed choices and make it part of how you do business. So I think that's absolutely key. Now, there's quite a few questions in the chat that are regarding fashion. Not a great surprise, because as we know, one of the biggest challenges is how we move to this linear to a circular economy. And I don't just think about circular economy as removing waste and pollution. I also think about it as an opportunity to have a positive impact on the people in the supply chain as well. And as we know with fashion, it accounts for 10% of the global carbon emissions. That's more than all of those international flights and logistics movements that we're talking about. And we're in a situation where a rubbish truck of textiles is dumped every single minute, every single second. Actually 87% of fashion is landfilled, and although 13% is supposed to be recycled, only 1% of it actually gets recycled back into another textile garment. So some real challenges around fashion. I'm going to come in a moment, Christian, to you for your thoughts on that. But first, Euan, I know, again, the Sustainability Consortium has done some quite interesting work in trying to understand what people do with their clothes. Can you explain a bit more?
Yeah, sure. So completely agree with all you've just said. I think everyone along that linear value chain has a responsibility to help make it circular. But what we see right now is that there are data gaps all over the place, but perhaps the biggest data gap is with the consumer themselves in how they actually use the clothes that they have bought, how they wash, dispose of that clothing and footwear. And there's lots of survey data that exists asking people what they think they do, but very little actual measured data for consumer behavior. And that makes designing solutions really, really hard. So we have a project called Project Wherever, and that's a collaboration with the CE100 and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. and the project was seed funded by Target, the big US retailer. And we got some clothes from Adidas and other brands like Fruit of the Loom and Wrangler and Tommy Hilfiger are involved. And in essence, we're running some field trials with volunteers where we're putting RFID tags into their clothes to see how they actually use them when they move out of the wardrobe, through the washing machine, they sit on the floor, etc., etc. And we're building up that data set almost in real time to get the new sorts of insights about those usage patterns. Of course, it means we can tell if they wash their socks as often as they say they do, but coming out of it is a really important data set that we will be publishing widely to help with those designs for future interventions by other people along the supply chain to make that linear supply chain as it is now a genuinely circular one. So yes, please volunteer if you'd like to get involved, but watch this space for that new data as it comes out.
That sounds fascinating. I know that my teenage children, it seems to land in a floor drobe most of the time, somewhere on the floor in the bedroom. So coming now, Christian, to you, in terms of how are you thinking about kind of the circular economy and how that applies, obviously, to luxury fashion?
I think that on the fashion, we have to split in two parts. We have fashion, which is called fast fashion, and when you go to the stores, you pay the products not that much, $10, $15 for a t-shirt, for example, things like that. And I think all this industry is thinking of how do I change the way the supply chain, the customers are acting on the impact of this fast fashion on the climate and all these topics. We are not on the fast fashion, so it's a little bit different, because when people are purchasing our products, hopefully our products are much more expensive, and so unless they are very rich, which happens sometimes, apart from that, the people want to keep their product for a long time. Nevertheless, to come to your question about circular economy, and I saw one question about how do you manage the issue on water stress, these kind of topics, and to come back to what Mark said also, we think in LVMH that we are too small to be able to manage all these issues by ourselves. What does it mean? It means that more and more, which is very good, we have many sectorial initiatives. We are discussing about palm oil, for example. We are using palm oil on our cosmetic, but we are quite small compared to L'Oreal, maybe Body Shop, and this kind of company. Nevertheless, there are initiatives, sectorial initiatives on palm oil. I could say also on mica, for example, mica, which is heavily used, which is a raw material which is at risk, because we have mines in countries where we know that we may have issues on environmental topics, child abuse, maybe, some slave issues. So we know that it's a category which is at risk. But once again, cosmetic, we are quite small. The bigger one are the automotive industry with paints for cars and things like that. So we want to participate to these sectorial initiatives. When we speak about fashion, cotton, which is a big issue on these days, we know that cotton is using a lot of water. We have issues with China, question about China, where it takes place. So around these questions, what we want to do also is when we have initiatives, and there are, for example, initiative on cotton with some certification, with GOAT certification or BCI. So we follow, and not only follow, we follow if we are quite small, but when we are big enough, we take a proactive initiative. And I can take just one other example, which is different, which is on the embroidery business, where we supply quite a lot from India. And then in India, we did start a few years ago an initiative with Kering, so meaning Gucci, Stella McCartney, these kind of companies, Burberry, and our Maison, to set, training, follow-up of the people, different things in place in India to follow the people who are producing the embroidery. So that's a key thing that we're trying to do is, I mean, supply chain by supply chain, which be considered as at risk, as Jamie was saying, focus on the one which are at risk, follow that, go as deep as you can or as you have to do, and then do the best that you manage all the issues. It could be human rights issues, environmental issues, maybe ethical or business ethic issues. So that's what we try to do as much as we can. But once again, we can't do that by ourselves. I think it's good when we collaborate all together on these issues, even if we are competitors. And on these topics, that's not the point.
Some really, really good points there, Christian. You're also really thinking about sustainable design, aren't you, as well? You're thinking about how you design things for longevity. You're thinking about them being timeless from that point of view as well. There's a question that's in the chat that's asking about, obviously, there used to be a case where luxury brands destroyed things if they hadn't sold at the end of season. Have you taken a strong line on that now?
I mean, clearly that's a good question, and we are working a lot on recycling. I mean, taking the raw material which were used to produce, I don't know, the bag, for example, and reintroducing this raw material in the production. That's one way. Or the other way could be on using them for something different. I mean, we have customers to whom we do some gifts, for example. So how can we use part of that to do something different for our customers? So it's something that we are working on.
Fantastic. Now, Mark, I'm going to come to you for your approach in terms of thinking about the circular economy. I see there's a few questions in the chat about food and that kind of move as we've seen towards regenerative agriculture. It might be great if you could pick that up in your question as well.
Yeah, I guess from our point of view, and it goes to, I think, the last point you're making with Christian, it comes down to the initial design of the product. So if you think about our cosmetic products, they effectively had two parts to them. They've got the product, you know, the thing you use, the face cream, the body wash, and then the packaging. And I've talked a little bit about the ensuring we have the sustainability of that supply chain, because ultimately, if you want to have a circular product, I mean, if you were to have a simple definition of it, it would be that in the use of the product or in the production of the product, you would, for example, absorb more carbon than was consumed in its production and use, or that in taking the biodiversity to make the ingredients, more biodiversity was preserved or was enriched through it. So we have a number of projects underway at the moment. So an example of that would be going back to the almost the bête noire of ingredients, palm. We have a project working in the Amazon or on the edge of the Amazon looking at agroforestry for palm, where we're taking degraded land which had previously been cattle grazing, and we've been able to put in place an agroforestry project which absorbs 3 to 4 times more carbon than regrowth of secondary forest, that is able to provide better income to the community or to the small-scale farmers who are producing it, which means that they then don't tend to stops them deforesting or helps them have a much more sustainable income. So you can do that kind of thing. There's obviously then making sure your production processes are efficient or even absorbing carbon through the way they're working. Ultimately, there is, of course, an end use for that product, which is where a lot of the carbon lies in our products. And then it's about designing into that product, how can it use less water? How can it use less energy? How can it rinse off more quickly? And that's where I think the real art in the design of the formula comes. The packaging end of it is more complex. And I guess that's where cosmetics comes into that fast fashion arena. You know, people buy a lipstick for the lipstick. They also buy it for the packaging, but at the end of it, you have the packaging left. So what are we doing in that area? Well, I mean, I guess the original cosmetic or the original hygiene product was soap, and soap used to be sold without packaging. So it's possible to do that. You can make soaps without packaging again. You can reformulate products to have things like dry shampoos, moisturizing bars, etc. So we can really minimize or eliminate packaging in some cases. It's then about making sure where you have packaging, it's actually properly recyclable. So Lots of companies working on trying to make sure that things like pumps or lipstick are made out of, at the moment they're made out of multiple plastics and metals, which means they don't go through the recycling supply chains. We're working with our suppliers and our designers to fix those problems, as are most people. But even then, it's fine for me to say they're recyclable, but if there's no infrastructure there, it's going to disappear out into the environment again. So the next stage of that is making sure that you actually take back from your customers. You offer them incentives to bring that packaging back, and you can properly put it into the supply chain. But really, none of those packaging examples are genuinely circular. They're just removing the problem, reducing the problem. I think you only really get to the point of circular in packaging for cosmetics, at least, once you're doing things like refills. So we have a number of different examples across our different businesses. The Body Shop, for example, you can go into our store on Bond Street. We've got a number of trials. It's actually been rolled out to, I think, 700 stores over the next 2 years, where you can take your bottle back in, and there's something that looks a little bit like a beer pump, and you can fill your shower gel back up again. Aesop, it's like more premium brand. You can bring your glass jar back into the store, and it's what I call the the Coke or the milk bottle model, where the bottle goes back and is rinsed and then is refilled and appears back on the shelf somewhere else. And we're also, because we're a very big direct sales business, saying, well, how can we do this with direct sales customers? How can those refill pouches go out to customers? They collect them, they put them in an envelope, they come back, they're washed and refilled. So you can begin to really have circular packaging. Beyond that, though, you've got to recognize that there is going to be leakage, and so how do you take some extra back? And we have a couple of projects, one in South America and one in India. And the one in South America is really quite substantial size, and the one in India is new this year, but we'll be collecting over 450 tons of plastic from the environment, working with waste pickers. That's then cleaned, hand sorted, and goes back into our own packaging. And we have the same thing going on across Brazil, which is being expanded out to the rest of South America. And that's a real, for me, circular economy solution, because you're actually positively removing waste from the environment. You're giving waste, plastic's an amazing thing. It's just bad if it's in the wrong place. You're giving it back its value. You're putting it back into a supply chain. You're giving people additional income and improving their livelihoods at the same time.
Fantastic, fantastic, Mark. Some great examples. And there's loads of questions popping up now, both on the chat and the questions and answer. I think one of them that's quite interesting is asking, how do you incentivize manufacturers to think about addressing the circular economy? So we've talked about consumers, but what about manufacturers? I don't know, Christian or Mark, if you have an answer to that you could pick up. Just whilst you're thinking about that, Christina, you've asked the question, are there collaborations and projects taking place between kind of courier companies? I mean, I would point to Loop as an example, which has brought lots of different brands together to look at a way of delivering home deliveries of refill capability. So have a look at Loop as an answer. Mark or Christian, either of you got an example for incentivizing manufacturers?
I could go first if you like. I think from a packaging point of view, what I've seen, being the procurement director now, well, I've just stopped being, but for 5 years been doing this. And at the start, 5 years ago, you went and talked to a plastic packaging manufacturer about closed loop or sustainable plastics, or they looked horrified. Every time I now have a plastics or packaging supplier come in to meet me, the first thing they want to do is to tell me about their amazing sustainability solutions, how they're working with companies, organizations like Loop, how they're looking at how they can, have bottles that can be posted through doors. They genuinely they've recognized the writings on the wall. Plastic is a bad word, basically. I think, as I said, there are ways of doing it well with having that kind of collecting it from the environment. And in fact, I believe that you ought to be able to talk about plastic as being a good thing in the right place. But the packaging manufacturers are all over it. They recognize that if they're the first to bring an affordable, recyclable pump to market, they will absolutely be able to, rake in the business. Similarly with other packaging solutions. And again, this comes back to the collaborative piece. They're recognizing that they need to be linked into supply chains, which can provide them with post-consumer recycled plastic. So they're building relationships with waste management companies, etc. So I think there's been such a substantial shift in customer and client demands that now most of those suppliers are absolutely prioritizing it. And frankly, the ones who aren't are going to disappear because they're just not going to have any business from proper customers.
Very good. Jamie, is there a cost associated with this? And what what would you say to businesses? You say, oh, this costs too much money. I'm not hearing enough consumer demand to do it.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just dovetail on the last question too, because I think they're kind of related to each other. As far as getting manufacturers to be more cooperative and make improvements, generically speaking, I think the first thing to do is make it known that it's important to you. And ideally that's in contract language, maybe difficult to do. But if you set a corporate goal around plastics or a corporate goal around reducing emissions, then it becomes clear to your suppliers that this is important to you. And then you have to show them how they compare to their peers. You have 50 manufacturers who are making something for you. And if you can easily show them with a click of a button on a nice anonymized dashboard that's going to say, look, you're in last place, and they see that, and the procurement manager sees that, it instantly becomes part of the conversation, and they're instantly concerned about it because they know it's important and they know they're not doing well. So we have to use data in really smart ways to kind of wake people up, right? And then I think it's about those kind of one-on-one interactions and what Mark is talking about. About cost, I guess I'm in the business of getting people to pay for transparency, right? Running a software company, so it's a common question that gets asked all the time. So I think there's kind of three areas of cost savings, right? The first is efficiency, right? If you're going to have people manually asking for information and trying to collate it and trying to make sense out of it, we all know that software can make that a much more efficient approach. But honestly, that's not why people buy a platform or why people invest in, across the board sustainability. You have to see that it's a good way of doing it, right? The other two angles are the much harder to quantify and much more important. And those are avoiding risk, avoiding reputational risk, avoiding disruption risk, avoiding the negative, and then doing the positive, right? Meeting your corporate goal, having great stories to tell, being able to show your consumers on a map where things come from, that's going to increase sales. Now, if you try to look at, when the disruption hit company X and what happened to their stock value, it's really hard to have empirical results. I mean, you can look across the board at Harvard Business Review to say, what was the monetary impact of not doing something, or what was the benefit of doing something? These things are all mixed up with 10 different factors at the same time that are affecting the positive and the negative, right? So we've kind of given up on saying, you're going to save this much money, you're going to avoid this many dollars of risk. But how many of you out there think it's okay not to have health insurance, right? It's that approach, right? It's saying you have to have a way to protect yourself and to be a forward-thinking company. We all know that sustainable companies perform better in the marketplace long-term. So how could it possibly be a bad idea to do that, right? And there's countless case studies of it. So that's kind of how we position it, is that if you want to be a healthy individual and you want to be protected, you have health insurance. If you want to take care of your business, you have to have transparency so that you can have resiliency and sustainability.
Really good point here. I mean, I think the concept that there are loads of benefits to business in embracing sustainability and gaining more resilient supply chains. Without any doubt, employees want to work for companies who've got a clear purpose. It does mean, therefore, you retain great staff. You want to be the customer of choice with both customers, but also if you're in the supply chain business to business, you want to be the customer of choice to your customer. And that comes with being able to guarantee quality product at the right place at the right time. Now, Euan, but coming very quickly to you, is there finance opportunities out there to support businesses with driving more resilient supply chains?
Yes, and I'm sure everyone on the webinar today has seen that explosion in the financial services community very broadly of different approaches and initiatives and new tools and services for companies. One specific example I'd just call out again through the partnership we have with HSBC is the Sustainable Supply Chain Finance Program. And often we hear about sustainability sort of as a zero-sum game. Suppliers saying, well, if you want me to give you the more sustainable thing, you're going to have to pay me more for it. And that's not a productive conversation. We need to find a way to break that cycle. And that's what we're trying to do here. So in partnership with HSBC and Walmart in the US, we set up a program where basically if a Walmart supplier can show that they're performing well on supply chain sustainability, they can go to HSBC and get reduced rates for their trade financing. And this is win-win because it breaks that cycle of if you want sustainable, you have to pay more. And it spreads the benefit along the supply chain. So I think we're going to see lots more of these sort of novel financing opportunities within supply chains, but then also for investment more broadly to break that cycle of I win, you lose.
And there might be some people feeling that this is all being left up to companies to come up with the answer. If we think about the other actors that need to be involved, what role do you think government and investors need to play to support you? Mark, would you like to have a go at that?
Why not? So, I mean, first of all, I've got to say that ultimately, you know, companies are responsible for their own supply chains. I mean, we, as part of the UNGP on business and human rights, know we have an absolute responsibility to identify, remediate, and guard against issues in our supply chains, and we have the same responsibilities for environmental impacts, etc. All that being said, within that same framework, governments and civil society also have a role to play, and we need the enabling environment to make these things work. So, you know, strongly support you know, the UK government around things like modern day slavery, the European Union looking at the transparency and due diligence requirements they're thinking about putting in place. We need to, the benefit of having those kind of structures around mean that when you're beginning to go and talk to your supply chains or your suppliers, or you're talking to other companies, you're all starting on, you know, the famous level playing field. Not want to refer to the Brexit negotiations, but you know, you have the same grounds for the beginning of the conversation, the same environment, the same way of measuring, etc. So, you know, I do strongly believe that governments have got a role to play in this, that enabling environment enables the thing to happen with lower transaction costs. From an investor's point of view, you know, what we can see, we've just raised $1 billion in capital, is that that was a very strong part of that pitch to investors was around the environmental aspects of our recent commitment to life, all the things we're going to be doing to make our products more sustainable, etc. So, you know, there's a strong interest from investors, and I think it comes back to this link with resilience, doesn't it? Ultimately, is that you can see that those resilient supply chains and companies who focus on this are generally more profitable and more sustainable and have a much stronger affinity with their customers, so they make better investments.
Such a great ending point. We're out of time. I'm afraid I didn't get to answer all of your many questions, but maybe that's a sign that another panel's needed.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Louise, Jamie, Euan, Mark and Christian. It's been an absolute pleasure having you for the chance to hear your insights and expertise on this matter. I think you're right, Louise. Maybe another round is definitely due. Thank you also for everyone that joined us. I hope that you did find it as informative and valuable. You will all receive the recording within the coming days, so please do keep an eye out for that email. On another note, we are already researching and preparing for next year's events and editorial opportunities. So if you are interested in getting involved, just like in an example like this panel or anything else, please do get in touch directly, and you can reach me at my email, lexia.croft@thomsonreuters.com. So that's it. Have a wonderful, lovely rest of the week. Stay safe and all the best. Thank you, everyone. All the best.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.